Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our discussion this afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, and I'm also the Deputy Director for our broader Asia program. We all know that U.S.-China relations are not in a particularly good place right now, and I think it's important that current U.S.-China tensions be viewed through their proper context. Here in this town, Beijing has long been seen by many policymakers as a competitor, a strategic competitor, and a rival. But under the Trump administration, the view of China has seemingly become more strident. So many of you will recall at the end of 2017, the Trump administration released its first national security strategy. And that document emphasized the growing challenges posed by strategic competition, and specifically in the context of China. So that essentially suggests that the Trump administration views China not just as a strategic competitor and a rival, but also as a broader national security challenge. So given that the U.S.-China relationship, because of the current trade spat and broader tensions, is likely to face some considerable strain for quite some time, I think it's useful to think about, or we think it's useful to think about the broader geopolitical implications of that strain, and particularly in terms of impacts for key global players like India. India is a significant global player, not just because of its own status as a rising power with a fast-growing economy and more than 1 billion people, but also because of its significant relationships with both Beijing and Washington. So India's relationship with China is complicated, to say the least. These are two strategic rivals who have fought a war with each other. There's still an unresolved border dispute, which led to a brief standoff about 2 years ago. But at the same time, they've got a significant trade partnership, and they cooperate quite frequently on the world stage in some key multilateral institutions like the AIIB and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, among others. And India's relationship with the United States, by contrast, is largely a sound one. India, of course, is a strategic partner of the United States. There's certainly some obstacles in the U.S.-India relationship, particularly some very real and serious ones on the trade side. But on the whole, thanks in great part to a fast-growing security relationship, this is a pretty strong partnership. And I'd actually go out on a limb and argue that the U.S. relationship with India, and particularly on the security side, is one of the few bilateral U.S. relationships with friendly states that has actually improved significantly in the Trump era. So all this is to say that I think it's worth having a discussion about what current U.S.-China tensions mean for India, and that's what we're going to do this afternoon. And we're delighted to have with us today one of the great experts, particularly from India, on this topic. And that, of course, is the man seated all the way to my right, Dr. Jagannath Panda, who's a research fellow and coordinator of the East Asia Center at the Institute for Defense Analyses in New Delhi, better known as IDSA. That's how many of us think of it. He's in charge of the East Asia Center's academic and administrative activities, including Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues with Chinese, Japanese, and Korean think tanks and institutes. He's authored a number of publications, including the books India-China Relations, Politics of Resources, Identity, and Authority in a Multipolar World Order, and also China's Path to Power, Party, Military, and the Politics of State Transition. We're also joined today by Jeff Smith, who is also a very esteemed expert on these issues. He'll be our commentator. He's a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Previously, he was director of Asian Security Programs and the Kramer Strategy Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. He has also produced a book on India-China relations. It's called Cold Peace, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the 21st Century. With that, before I forget, I just wanted to thank our institutional co-sponsor today, which is the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. We appreciate your support for this event. With that, no one really came here to hear from me, so I will let our panel begin. So, Dr. Panda, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Michael for this invitation, and great to be here at the Wilson Center. Also, great to have my old friend Jeff, on whom I have great appreciation for many years now. We are working together on many projects in the sense that particularly exchanging ideas on India-China relations. Happy to be here and thanks for coming for this talk. When actually Michael approached me that what we should be discussing, and he proposed that something of this nature, well, Jeff could also pitch in. We did discuss that, I don't know about Michael, but definitely I'm not an economist. And
Neither am I.
okay. But definitely this topic is such that I think we can't avoid the economics, but it's beyond economics. And that's the triggering point here, that the tensions we are currently witnessing in U.S.-China relations, it has enormous implications for the world, for the regions, whether India is a beneficiary or India is going to be affected in the process. This is the point we are going to discuss here. Let me share my thoughts on the subject, and I'll welcome your comments and questions, and also given the fact that Jeff also covers India and US, I'd also welcome his comments in the process. Just to start with, let me address that fundamental questions what Michael has put in front of all of us, that what this current tensions in US and China means to India, and how does India really look at it? And I think the same question could be posed for each and every country in the world. The fundamental answer to this question should be that it's the national interest that counts first. And I think for India, India would look at its own national interest and would like to take advantage in the process. And there is no denying about that. And that's the fundamental answer I would provide in front of you, that even though US is a strategic partner, closer strategic partner, China is an unavoidable immediate neighbor, India would look at its own benefit in the process. Now, when I say that it really national interest that matters, what kind of national interest really from India's point of view we are talking about? And I think there are 2-3 points, backgrounders, we need to keep it in mind. One is that in the case of India, it is an emerging economy that matters. And emerging economies are always aspiring powers, aspiring economies. And they would like to take the advantage in the process, in the sense that without really making it look like quite provocative, without really indulging themselves in the power politics, they would like to maintain a balance to take the advantage. Number 2, I think one of the fact about India, which has been accepted, is that in the realms of Indo-Pacific, India is a key actor. And I think it has been accepted that it is the fulcrum of Indo-Pacific. And therefore, if US-China rivalry, which seems to be going to Indo-Pacific currently, it is going to intensify further, then India would really look to take the advantage in terms of positioning itself in Indo-Pacific in such a way that it will look beyond the US-China rivalry to position its interest, its foreign policy positioning, its foreign policy posturing, to strengthen its relations with a range of countries in the regions, not only to have economic benefits, but also the security and strategic benefits. The third is, I think, what is really unavoidable from India's point of view, and I think that's the most important thing, is that US rivalry with China could be a kind of course, somebody has argued that it is more of a American-China war than China's American war. In that context, I think India has to really relook a lot of issues with its immediate partner, China. Tribal, the old rivalry, the boundary disputes, all of these things are the permanent factor between India and China probably. And in next few decades, we are not going to solve some of these problems. But I think India has to relook at the way India used to look at rise of China. All of this while in last 1.5 decade and 2 decades, rise of China has not necessarily been a threat or a concern to India. Even though there are qualms, there are concerns, has been quite obviously been written, particularly linking it with the boundary and border dispute. But then rise of China, if China continues to grow, its economy is continuing going to do well, India has to reassess its strategy. I think that's the framework where India would like to position itself. Now, coming back to the U.S.-China rivalry, we know that the triggering point behind this rivalry is the trade friction of the problems relates to the tariff. And I think there are 2 or 3 main allegations which has been made on China, not only by the United States, but by a range of countries, and that needs to be mentioned. One is that China is continuously involved in practicing unfair trade. And that has not been the concern of the US only. Of course, the current rivalry and the current, if one could rightly call it a war, I think it is led by US. And others have probably not joined, but the concerns about others has been quite open in the out for last few years. The second allegations about China, which has been in the public realm, is that it steals intellectual property. And I think in both these cases, be it the unfair trade practice or the stealing the intellectual property, India is a victim, and India would continue to be a victim. And that's the thing which is going to shape India's foreign policy posturing, India's positioning in times to come. But I think more than that, if you see, I think this rivalry is more than trade and tariffs. And as we all understand, that trade and tariff conflict between US and China is just one aspect of this conflict. It's much bigger conflict, and we know that it's boiling for some time now. And we know that there has been thesis written about this. Thucydides start to somebody would say that it's a great power rivalry which is going to continue and shape the future world politics in times to come. But I think one reality is which is going to be the triggering point here for countries like India and many other countries is that we, no matter how much we try to shake China's rise to some extent would be unavoidable. And that's the reality. I think the way we used to treat China's rise all this while, after this trade conflict, China would like to revisit its own rise, and most of the countries in the regions, either China's partners, China's economic partner, strategic partner, or the countries which are currently having problematic relations with China, they are going to reassess China's rise in a new way. I mentioned that this rivalry is not really about trade and tariff as it appears to be. It's about a lot of other factors. And therefore, it needs to be really discussed in details that what this rivalry is all about and why we are really talking about that this rivalry is going to continue. Sitting in India, the way we see at it, or at least I could claim for myself that the way I look at it, I think from US point of view, we do see that there are a number of things which is troubling US, and therefore this rivalry is not about trade and tariffs. The first factor which is troubling the US in our point of view is that the rapid rise of China, the unprecedented rise of China, and particularly since the introduction of the Belt and Road initiatives, the way the Chinese are operating. Now, if you see the Belt and Road initiatives, I have held this view for a long time that Xi Jinping might be in fact, under Xi Jinping, this Belt and Road initiative might have been introduced. But actually, whatever we are seeing under Xi Jinping's tenure within the framework of Belt and Road initiatives, all of these issues were actually primarily been introduced during the period of Hu Jintao. Be it China's Go West policy, be it China's trading, China emerging as a trading country, China's adventure to the Indian Ocean regions, China, started signing the partnerships, strategic partnerships. What they actually call most of the strategic partnership is the development partnership. All of these things has actually goes back to 1.5 decades back when Hu Jintao was arriving in power. And I think since that time, 2003 and 4, a lot of things are happening in China's rise, which we tend to overlook, and India has certainly overlooked all this while, and that needs to be reassessed about China's rise. The second is the unilateral trading arrangements, the practice the Chinese are following all this while. If we see from 2003 or 4 or 5 onwards, the trade ties of China with across the world with most of the major economies have gone up. But China does enjoy trade surplus with most of the economies. And that is one of the factors that we need to really talk about. I will show you one map, which I prepared a year back. If you see this map, from 2006 or 7 onwards, when Hu Jintao actually started his second tenure as the president of China, China has been successful in terms of establishing more than 25 establishments since that time across the Indian Ocean region. Some of them are trading points, some of them are stationing points, some of them are strategic bases, naval points. And all of these things has actually helped China to emerge as a trading economy, as a trading maritime power. And that has been one of the key features about China's rise. And from United States' point of view, this has been one of the triggering point. As I do see that, I think this is where the rise of China has been the key issue, and that is actually threatening the supremacy of the United States in some ways. I think the next point, which has really been a factor for the US, is China's emergence as a technological power. Again, we have seen that they have now this Make in China 2025 initiatives. But I think one of the triggering point has been is that China has not really been a hesitant power to talk about technological cooperation, upgrading its technology and trying to link it with development-oriented partnership that they are establishing throughout the world. That is one aspect which has been the key triggering point behind this conflict, and that has been a worrisome factor for the US. I think one more factor which is really coming as a matter of concern for the US, the way we see it, is that China is systematically replacing US as the most influencing actor in most of the sub-regions of Asia. I think if you see in South Asia, there was a time when United States used to be the most prevailing actor. That's not be the case anymore. We have seen that China has emerged as one of the most influential economic actor in the South Asian regions. This is what we have been seeing in Central Asia too. In Central Asia, of course, they invested a lot over the last 2.5 decades. 1996, 97, they established the Shanghai Five, and 2001 was the triggering point when they established the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And since that time, if you see, they have been continuously focusing on Central Asia and the Eurasian regions. Today, they are having one of the most important aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative, that is the SRAP, Silk Road Economic Belt. The way the Chinese have orchestrated there, they have not really entered into any specific power rivalry. Their power has never been challenged in over the last 2 decades. Their partnership with Russia has tremendously helped them. Of course, there are undercurrents in Russia-China relationship. There are problems between them, but they have not really allowed those problems. It's been an effective management strategy by the Chinese in the Central Asian regions. Look at the Northeast Asia. That's the regions where the Chinese are having the only and one significant alliance partner, that is the North Korea. Despite of all the problems, the Chinese never allowed the situation to go out of hand, even though the North Koreans were threatening to go for a war-like situation 2 to 3 years back. The Chinese were the effective manager. They never allowed the situation to go out of the, be it in the United Nations Security Council, imposing the sanction, or in terms of managing the relationship between the two Koreas in the regions. They never allowed the regions, the security concerns in the region to go out of hand. Look at Southeast Asia. they have been a traditional player in Southeast Asia, but one of the triggering point of the Chinese outreach has been that they have effectively divided the ASEAN community, be it the South China Sea dispute, or be it trying to restrict the unity that was possible under the ASEAN framework. It is the Chinese which has been dividing the ASEAN communities for all this while. And in all of this situation, barring Northeast Asia, China has been the prevailing actor. In South Asia, China has actually replaced US. And this has been a major concern for the United States, the way India look at it, or I would look at it. I think as this map shows, the next triggering point is the region of the Indian Ocean regions. And here, I think if the Chinese would not be in a position to challenge the supremacy of the US over the next 1.5 decades, but at least they are building their capacity massively here. And that has been one of the challenging factors. Now, if you see from the China's point of view, this rivalry, we try to read it that I think it is a given that after the 9/11 incident, the Chinese always held the view that it's time to improve their capabilities across the world gradually, while trying to make or pitch a context where they could be considered as a G2 country. Of course, we know for a fact that there is nothing called G2, and probably the Chinese were hesitant in 2006, 7, 8 when the G2 formulation really came up. The Chinese were hesitant to accept it because they were not ready. But as a matter of fact, in each and every aspect, they made it a point to make it count that they are rising very fast and they would like to share the platform or the table with the United States of America. Another factor from the Chinese side regarding this rivalry has been the Chinese, they try to read the situation from a holistic point of view by saying and arguing that probably most of the countries in the world, they have accepted China's rise except the United States. And this trade rivalry has been triggered by the United States primarily because the US is unable to come to the terms to accept China's rise. And we know in our interaction with the Chinese institutions across China, you will hear that it is continuously argued that the Chinese today remain quite convinced that US would not really like to accept China's rise at any cost, not only in Asia, but elsewhere in the world. I think also one triggering point, what really China thinks about this rivalry is that the intention of the US, I think the intention of the US, they try to link it that is much more domestic oriented about China's domestic constituency. And they try to link it that probably the intent on the part of the US is to destabilize the regime in China and try to economically pressure China by doing this trade and tariff conflict and try to pressurize the framework, the guidelines that Communist Party is proposing to its own audience and to the outside world. So it's a rivalry which is not limited to the trade and tariffs, and it is seen in a wider context from both the sides. How is India looking at this rivalry, and then how it's really going to affect India in the process? We know for a fact that there is an offensive strategy involved in terms trade and tariffs conflict with China. And from Chinese side, if you see, their response has been quite bold, but at the same time very careful. The Chinese are open to the dialogue, to discussion, to have new kind of opportunities with the new countries in the regions, and therefore they do look India as a partner. But I think in the process, it is given that India is going to be affected because of the US-China trade rivalry. One area where India is, it is quite clear that India is going to be affected is that the kind of supply chain networks India is a part of. I think all of this imposition of tariffs and the restrictions are going to affect not only China, but also the regional economies, including India. The second is, I think in all of this US-China trade rivalry, I think there is also certain amount of conviction in DC or in the Trump administration to also address all of the economic grievances that US is having with other economies, including India. And it is going to affect India to some extent, particularly when US decided to withdraw the preferential treatment from India. And also what we have seen that India has also responded to the thing. So India is a victim in the process. But I think more than the victim, we do look this rivalry more as a strategic opportunity for India's rise. And let me explain that part in a detailed way. That why do we see that this tensions is going to be really in the interest of India if India manages to play its cards, its relationship with US and China properly. I think it goes without saying that if any country in the regions which is going to be beneficial out of the process, that is India, primarily because we have a very good network of strategic understanding with both the countries, with the US and with China. With the US, it goes that we are one of the most effective partner, most important strategic partner. Unlike the US alliance partners in the Asia like Japan and South Korea, I think we are an important actor without which US cannot really have an effective Indo-Pacific strategy in the regions. And if you take the India-US relationship into account, it's not really the trade and economic partnership that has been the key. It is the defense and the security partnership between India and US has been the triggering point of their relationship. What we see in terms of Kamkasa to other defense agreements and US declaring India as a major defense partner is a signal that this relationship is moving fast to become and to emerge as most important relationship in Indo-Pacific configuration, and it is going to really be China-oriented, China-specific in terms of balancing out China's outreach in the regions. But I think India would really like to see a more comprehensive engagement, more comprehensive partnership with the US in order to take the advantage in the process. That is what really missing at this moment. What we are currently seeing between India and the US is mostly a security and defense-oriented engagement between the two. Even though the business communities between India and US are still being the most important aspect of its relationship, but I think given the unpredictability that attached with the Trump administration and its foreign policy, not many in India are really convinced about a stronger and robust India-US economic partnership. And I think if India manages to promote its economic understanding, trade and economic understanding with the US, then India would be in an advantageous position out of this US-China trade rivalry. The second one is, I think, the way India is going to position itself from this conflict. And I think many countries, they are trying to readjust their foreign policy in the process that, given the unpredictability that is there with the Trump administration, given the authoritarian approach that the Chinese have implemented under Xi Jinping, we do see that a lot of returning and a lot of redesigning is happening in regional foreign policies of South Korea, of Japan. Many ASEAN countries are revisiting their foreign policy, including India. And I think Indian foreign policy will notice some changes, if not drastic changes, with the arrival of Modi for the second term. And keeping in mind that the US-China trade tensions is going to continue, and keeping also, most importantly, in mind that an authoritarian leadership in China is going to continue in power. So in that context, I think India would really like to reposition itself as a emerging Indo-Pacific country in order to strengthen its rise with the immediate and extended neighbor. And I think one of the most important factor that would India would like to implement in its relationship in its foreign policy is how to strengthen the networks with ASEAN. And I think ASEAN is key in the sense because it is linked with the regional value chain. It is a a key economic partner for India. And today, when we are talking about RCEP configuration, the conclusion of RCEP, India would like to make it sure that India is having a continuous and strengthened relationship with ASEAN. We know for a fact that India-ASEAN relationship is moving to the next level when it comes to connectivity, when it comes to infrastructural cooperation, but nothing really much has done between India and ASEAN. That is one area where India would like to work on, and therefore you will see India's Act East policy, which has been implemented, which has been redesigned under Modi from its Look East framework, is going to be factoring ASEAN much more than previously. Apart from ASEAN, you will see that India focusing a lot on the regional economies like Japan and South Korea. Of course, with Japan, one could see that probably we are having the best of ties with Japan in Asia. And we are today having a special and global partnership with Japan. Japan is a key economic actor in India's domestic constituency. It is involved in smart city projects, to road construction, to railway projects, to bringing out different developmental programs within India. In fact, Japan is the only actor which is allowed to invest in Northeast India, which is not really a business-friendly regions in India. But India has given that green light to Japan as a special and global partner. But apart from Japan, I think India is going to take advantage and would cooperate with South Korea. And about India-South Korea relationship, despite of all the goodness, this has not really taken off. And today, earlier in the day, I was discussing with a Korean professor in a panel discussion about India-South Korea relations. This is a relationship of substance and opportunity. In fact, today, if you see from the South Korean point of view, they are having a new southern foreign policy, which is ASEAN-centric, and it factors India importantly. India would like to capitalize on that. So apart from ASEAN, Japan and South Korea are going to be the two key actors with whom India would like to upgrade its relationship in the background of this U.S.-China trade rivalry. Of course, Australia could be another country to cooperate with, but with Australia, I don't really see much happening given the strategic gap that exists between both the countries. But I think India's approach in the process would be not to entirely also distance itself from the conflict. And the reason I'm arguing is that I think we have to see the way India has positioned all this while in the history of U.S.-China relationship. In the history of U.S.-China relationship, we have seen is that India has never taken a side, even though India would like to identify itself as a key strategic partner of the United States. We have played our card smartly in the sense that we have strengthened our relationship with US all this while also equally strengthening our relationship and partnership with China. In fact, in the 21st century, if you see, the India-China, despite of the classical boundary problem, the problems of Tibet, problems of day-to-day affairs, including water to other maritime undercurrents, India-China relationship has actually grown. And this has not really been at the cost of India-US relationship. So both the relationship has actually grown hand to hand, and that has been one of the key features of Indian foreign policy. We have maintained a equicordial, a good balance between the two supreme economies, and this is what going to continue. Even though we would really like to position ourselves more with the US in pressurizing China, and I think India would like to maintain an even balanced approach, given the fact that there is a president in China who is going to be there in power for the next 10 years. India is actually engaged with China in a range of forums, for example, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to New Development Bank under the BRICS, to a lot of other multilateral mechanisms. What is really going to be the triggering point in India-China relationship in this trade conflict is that we would pressurize China on a different note. We would pressurize China by saying, by raising the concerns that India is having all this while, With China, our trade's deficit is growing quite massively. And I think that is one area India is going to concentrate upon. We would ask the Chinese to come and address the trade deficit issue as soon as possible. And this is, again, thanks to the U.S.-China trade rivalry. One thing which has really become to the forefront is that U.S. has been successfully internationalizing the gray areas that China has been actually overlooking to address with most of the countries. And therefore, this is an opportune time for India to raise some of these issues. While at the bilateral level, we would like to really force China to address the trade deficiency and open up the domestic market for Indian companies, we'd also ensure that India should take maximum advantage with its cooperation with China in multilateral forums in terms of gaining maximum investment projects. And you could see from this map, AIIB is actually flooding out the projects throughout Asia. And India is a key beneficiary of the AIIB projects. Of course, we are a founding member. We are the second largest economy, second largest vote sharing power in the AIIB formulation. But a good beginning has actually started. And we would like to continue with that. So this is an advantage and opportune time with China for India. And particularly at a time when Xi Jinping is coming to India next month. In fact, just coming to DC, there was this announcement that Xi Jinping is going to be in India in October 12 to 13. After the Wuhan consensus, there has been a broad consensus between India and China that no matter what happens between the two countries, we need to see each other as a close developmental partner. And that's the defining line in India-China relation, which is going to shape India's approach towards China. We would expect a lot from China, demanding a lot from China to address the gray areas, as well as to take the advantage of the process. One of the other factor, from India's point of view, with regard to US, we would like to concentrate is to strengthen capacities in the Indo-Pacific regions. In the background of the US-China conflict, what we have seen is that there is a new kind of foreign policy positioning is happening in Japan. Japan is looking at India in a new context. Japan is trying to strengthen its relationship with other actors. In fact, we saw that Japan also wants to strengthen its relationship with China. So taking the kind of foreign policy repositioning, redesigning happening in Japan, India would also equally try to improve, strengthen the India-Japan relationship further. But this is not going to be against the US because we know that we are a part of the Indo-Pacific configuration. We are a part of the quadrilateral alliance network, quadrilateral configuration network. And I think strengthening India-Japan relationship is in the interest of the US. And this is one factor which would encourage India also to strike a new range of dialogues, new mode of contacts and discussion with the United States. With India and the United States, I think there has been a lot of talk about defense and security cooperation, to some extent bilateral trade and economic cooperation, but the regional component, the Indo-Pacific component is currently missing. With US introducing ARIA, Indo-Pacific initiatives and other key initiatives in the Indo-Pacific regions, this is an opportune time when we could actually talk about capacity building in Indo-Pacific. And therefore, I do show this map, what India and Japan are actually talking between them in terms of building growth, developments, carry out infrastructural development projects in the Indo-Pacific. US could be a partner. In fact, there are trilateral configuration, India, US, Australia, India, US, Japan. And all of these trilateral and quadrilateral frameworks not only need to be improved, but between India and US, we need to have more discussion about how to bring the realities of Indo-Pacific into account, for example, infrastructure development to connectivity, to building port networks and stationing points. All of these things need to be discussed between India and US. And I think this is an opportune time for India, and India would like to play a delicate balance between India and US. Now, The last point is that what is the future of US-China rivalry, and how does India look at it, and whether India would still like to be a beneficiary in the process, the way India would like to unfold in its own interest. I think the future of US-China relationship is very uncertain. We know for a fact that no matter what happens, the relationship has arrived at a stage where we don't really see that this relationship is returning to its old status quo position. But one thing is given that no matter what happens, China's rise has to be really reinterpreted, both re-rate both in US and in Indian context. We don't know how US is really reading China's rise, but in Indian context, I think we do see that China's rise will be inevitable. Unless Chinese economy is really struggling, unless the Belt and Road Initiative is not really going to take off, China's rise is going to be inevitable, and I think that is not necessarily going to be a concern and threat to India. There are elements in China's rise which are going to be a concern for India. For example, China's maritime adventure in Indian Ocean, that is going to be a bigger concern for India, and therefore India needs to have a stronger relationship with the US and like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific regions. I conclude by saying that it is a strategic moment for an actor like India, which is an which is an emerging economy in the regions, which is an aspirant power in the regions. But at the same time, India needs to really play a balanced and a cautious approach in terms of involving itself in the US-China rivalry. I don't really see India doing that. Instead of only taking occasional interest on issues which affects India. At the same time, this is definitely an opportune time for India's rise, and US should welcome India's rise in the region. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for a very rich, very comprehensive overview. Covered a lot of ground. Very interesting, very useful. Before we go to a discussion, I wanted to give Jeff Smith an opportunity to respond. So, Jeff?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me here today. This was an easy event to say yes to, not only because I'm fascinated with the triangular relationship between these three countries. I think it's one of the most important three-way relationships in the world, but also because I owe a debt of gratitude to my colleague here, Jagannath. Back when I was a young, naive scholar studying China-India relations, coming to India for the first time, over 10 years ago, knew very few people, wasn't up to speed on how things worked in Delhi, and Jagannath was very, very kind to me at the time with his time, with helping me establish contacts, with helping me understand the intricacies of the China-India relationship, and I valued that very much. And so anytime you need another participant in one of these events, I'll always be there. And somehow I noticed in the past 10 years, I've aged 15 years and you look 2 years younger. So you need to give me the secret juice, my friend. We're all jealous. I'm going to keep it very short, first because you covered a lot of ground and there's very little that I would disagree with. I think you did a great job framing the dynamics between the three countries now and getting directly to the question at hand. I'll just very briefly say that it's important to contextualize where China and India were, where they are now, when we ask this question: what do U.S.-China tensions mean for India? And in the sort of ebb and flow of China-India relations, we've been at, since 2016, a more stable point, a higher point. So since 2018. So since 2016 and 2017 were rough years in China-India relations for several reasons. There were some pretty intense disputes over the nuclear suppliers group, China's efforts to block India from joining the NSG, from China's support for terrorists, shielding of terrorists based inside Pakistan, shielding them from sanctions at the UN. And of course, the unprecedented border dispute in the Doklam Plateau in the region where Bhutan, India, and China meet in the summer of 2017. And there was the Wuhan summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, which, while there really wasn't much substance to come out of that summit, it really didn't change any underlying dynamics, it did at least set the relationship back on a manageable, stable trajectory. And so the U.S., the Trump administration's broadsides on China, the elevation of the U.S.-China rivalry under the Trump administration, began to unfold at a time where China-India relations were relatively stable in their own context. And in fact, border incursions last year, it's not a particularly important metric, but it is a metric for taking the temperature of China-India relations. We're down last year fairly significantly. India had been showing some reluctance to do things that would be seen as overtly provocative toward China, including upgrading the Quad to the ministerial level, something that the U.S. and Japan have expressed interest in, including bringing Australia into the Malabar naval exercises, including keeping the Tibetan government and the Dalai Lama at arm's length. Not joining infrastructure initiative launched by the U.S., Australia, and Japan to provide alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I just say that to kind of set the scene and say that India had been trying to keep relations with China at a stable and manageable level when the Trump administration really began exerting pressure on China. So what do U.S.-China tensions mean for India? I think Jagannath really summed it up well, and he was quite direct in saying it's a strategic opportunity for India. I think it directly benefits in a sense that India shared many of the concerns that the Trump administration has been raising with China, many of the concerns over its trade practices, barriers to investment, intellectual property, and general aggressiveness and assertiveness on the international stage. So India, among other countries, at least segments, like to see some pushback against Chinese assertiveness. I think India also benefited somewhat significantly in an indirect way in that the Chinese have been quite good at recalibrating pressure across multiple fronts. So when they feel under siege from the U.S., Beijing has traditionally done a pretty good job trying to ease pressure across other fault lines, whether it be with Japan, with India, with ASEAN, and if Indian officials are quite candid that they've been seeing a much nicer China since trade tensions began to pick up, that there's been a charm offensive from Beijing because China doesn't want to be fighting too many battles at the same time either. And so I think there's been a willingness. I don't think many Indian strategists are under major illusions about what that charm offensive means, that there's going to be a fundamental change in some of the legacy disputes, but I think they're at least willing to bank whatever benefits they can while China is being friendlier. I think the tensions also diminish some fears of a G2, as Jagannath mentioned. In my opinion, these were always overblown. But there was a segment in India and elsewhere that thought that there was a potential risk that the United States and China would come to some sort of arrangement or agreement or level of cooperation where they decide to manage global and regional affairs together without letting other regional actors have a say. That would the United States seek at some point to appease China or to reap economic benefit at the expense of others' interests? And this sense, I think, began to pick up during the Obama administration, particularly when the U.S. began launching discussions with China on South Asia. And I think that worried some folks in Delhi that sort of fear of the G2 began to coalesce around that idea. But if those fears weren't dispelled before, I think it's safe to say they have been now. So in what way might U.S.-China tensions be bad for India? I think that's in some ways a more interesting question. And I think on balance, it's a net benefit. But if you tried to imagine how it could be bad, one way is if the intensification of the China-U.S. rivalry leads to more pressure on India to choose, to pick sides. And there was a famous exchange in January, I believe, between General Petraeus and now Foreign Minister Jaishankar, in which, in Delhi, in which General Petraeus essentially said countries are going to have to choose. U.S.-China rivalry is sharpening, you have to choose. And Jaishankar said, you have to take a side. Isn't that what he said? Yeah. Countries now have to take a side. And Jaishankar said, we already have. I've taken my side. This is the driving motivation behind Indian foreign policy now is to maintain its strategic autonomy and not be forced into fighting other people's battles, not to be forced into overt dependency on other countries, on a superpower. And so I think that makes India nervous in a way, the idea that America will now come to India expecting it to be a more forceful balancer, a more forceful actor for pushback against Chinese interests, that there will be impatience in the U.S., that we've been sold a bill of goods, that India was supposed to be this great ally against China, but we're not seeing it. We're not seeing the real pushback. Where is it? Now, those of us who have followed India for a long time, I think, have realistic expectations about what India will and won't do. But there's a more simplistic narrative here in Washington that I think has, in some ways, created inflated expectations about what India might or might not do in this endeavor. And there's a risk of a mismatch between expectations and reality. So if there was one potential downside for India, I would maybe point to that. And I would just ask, I would ask you to maybe offer, what do you see as maybe the two biggest risks and the two biggest opportunities if the China-U.S. rivalry grows even sharper in the years ahead for India? Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And no, those are some good questions to pose to Jagannath, so I certainly would be interested to hear his responses. Let me pose one more question for you while you're writing down your responses to the other question. We heard about the strategic opportunity, potential strategic opportunity for India posed by U.S.-China tensions. My question is, how significant an obstacle are the current tensions in U.S.-India relations? And they're mainly on the commercial side. I'm talking about the trade issues. How significant an obstacle could those be for India's ability to avail itself of this strategic opportunity posed by U.S.-China tensions? So I'll add that to the mix as well. Please.
Okay. Let me first comment on Jeff's questions. I think the risks and opportunities are even-handed. There are always greater risk in this relationship because we need to understand that it's a fight between two big economies. So the impact for any regional economies for value chains to the regions is massive. If it is going to intensify, it is going to affect the value chain networks in the regions. But to India, I think there are two specific risks this US-China rivalry may pose in coming times. One is that, let's not forget, despite of our problems with China, India's trade and economic ties with China is still growing at a very good rate. Mm-hmm. If we take the example of India's trade and economic ties with South Korea and Japan, that has not really taken off. the two prominent economies in the regions. But with China, despite of all the problems, it's steadily, gradually taking off. So any impact, any big impact in the value chain networks, any intensification in US-China trade relations, there has to be some impacts on India-China trade and economic contacts. We know for a fact that trade and economic contacts, we might tend to perceive it as a bilateral oriented configuration, but they are not. They are not, because trade and economic exchanges are always closely linked with the regional value chains, to third country cooperation, to exchange of goods at the regional level, particularly at a time when we are talking about regional comprehensive economic partnership, and when we are talking about free trade agreements between the countries. We cannot really draw optimism out of this US-China rivalry. If it is going to continue, extend further, it will have enormous impact on India-China trade and economic configuration and their bilateral trade and economic cooperation. The other risk I could see is that probably we might not really see China really getting punished in terms of from other countries. I mean, any progress in the US-China trade and tariff conflicts, it's always going to be probably more bilateral oriented rather than regional countries supporting to these tensions further. Not at a point when Japan is trying to reconfigure its relationship with China, not at a time when RCEP is on the verge of conclusion, not at a time when Japan, South Korea tensions are also rising. So I don't really see that whether this is an opportune time when we could really punish China the way we would like to be punished, and the way all the countries could build a coalition to punish China. So there is a greater risk also involved in that on the one hand, we might pressurize China to address some of our concern, but on the other hand, it will be a new, it will be a new era for China, as Xi Jinping is continuously talking about, to build a new mode of relationship across Asia to take benefits out of it. So that is also another risk that India and US needs to really take into account. But as I mentioned, I think the two biggest opportunities for India is to look for alternative economies to strengthen its ties, particularly with Japan and South Korea, including ASEAN. And the second biggest opportunities for India out of this process is to think independently about its rights. We have always actually been in some sort of relied power on the US. As you rightly mentioned, that there is a virtual understanding has always been a key backbone of India-US relations. And given the recent demand from the US has actually been a concern for India at many levels. And as you pointed out that there is a voice from US that you need to take a side, that has not really been received well in India. And if we link it with Iran conflict to other issues, regional issues, including North Korean issue, there are actually problematic areas in India-US relation which is not really helping both the countries to come together. Similarly, in India-China, problems are plenty. So I think this is a period of opportunity for India and India's rights. India would start looking at its own course more independently, moving away from US, moving away from China, and probably going more in a own autonomous regional framework of cooperation. And I think this is an opportunity for India if I would see it both in economic and strategic realm. But again, this is definitely a conflict which is going to have enormous implications for India, like many other countries. About Michael's questions, I think you have actually partly answered my my point in your initial remarks. Is that when we're talking about US-China rivalry, we know for a fact that we are talking about two continental powers, US approach towards Asia and China's approach towards US or towards the West. And in a big way, it is not only a great power rivalry, it is a power between US alliance partners and China's strategic partners. So that has to be kept in mind that the economic and the strategic configurations are very closely linked with. And India could be a big beneficiary out of this process. As I mentioned, we are connected with China in many alternative forums in recent times, from NDB to AIIB. We might have a serious objection to China's Belt and Road initiatives, but the platform of cooperation between India and China has actually expanded over the last 1.5 decades. And that's the reality. Not only India's cooperation with China, but with a range of other countries' cooperation with China. So that's actually a setback for the US in some ways, the way we look at it. So, of course, it needs to be seen in a US specific point of view to what extent you could see that US is going to take advantage out of this process, its rivalry with China. But then there's no denying to the fact that there is a new configuration is emerging in Asia that needs to be looked at. China's configurations, China's relationship architecture with a range of Asian countries, and Asian countries are also looking at China in a new way, particularly keeping in mind that China is offering new projects, new developmental initiatives, programs, and Xi Jinping is going to stay in power for another 10 years or so.
Well, thank you. Well, let's go to you all because I'm sure there'll be questions. So please wait. Once I call on you, wait until you have a microphone in front of you, just because we're live streaming this and we want to make sure people listening around the world can hear your excellent question. Please try to pose just one question and keep it brief, and if you could identify yourself as well. So we'll start here with Michael, and then we'll make our way around. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. You've said a great deal about American views, Indian views, but I haven't heard very much about Chinese views. How do you think China, in the present context, looks at India? Is it just a tactical issue, as Jeff Smith suggested, that when China feels itself under pressure from the United States, it reaches out to its neighbors and charm of various ways? But that's essentially a tactical approach. So how do you think China looks at India right now?
Go ahead.
Yeah, interesting point. In fact, partly this has been answered by Jeff when he said, from the tensions India and China are having recently. I think it has to be understood in context of India-China relations and China's new approach towards India. If we try to understand, I think in last 2 decades or so, if we revisit at the beginning of the 21st century, China never looked India that seriously. China always treated India as a secondary power, even in fact not as a secondary power. China never counted India as a serious power. There has been a subtle change in Chinese perception with regard to that. And there are a number of factors that has encouraged the Chinese to revisit their approach towards India and to look at India in new ways. One is, of course, the arrival of Modi government. And I think the current government in India has been quite nationalist in its approach, and that has been rightly noted in Chinese foreign policy making. They have noted the kind of initiatives the current government has taken in terms of not only approaching the other powers, I mean the big powers, US, Japan, South Korea, but also the way the current government has improved the relationship with the smaller and neighboring countries in the regions. The second fact is the kind of initiatives the current government has taken that has actually encouraged China to revisit its approach towards India. For example, we might really keep on talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative, how grand it is, and the kind of benefit it provides to the smaller economies and all. We tend to forget and overlook one fact, that under this current government in India, they have introduced and reintroduced some of the connectivity and developmental projects, which has actually made India to become regionally accepted as an economic power. For example, we have today flagship connectivity projects in the Indian neighborhood. We have proposed a concept like SAGAR, security and growth for all in the regions in the maritime domains. We have been one of the key countries to carry out maritime exercises with the big powers, and also we are one of the countries which has been cooperating in the maritime domain with the smaller countries. And all of these things has been quite significantly been noted in the by the Chinese policymakers. I think what China has really noticed is that at no point in Indian history we had a comprehensive foreign policy towards our immediate and extended neighborhood. Today, if you see the Indian foreign policy map, in the East, we are having an Arctist foreign policy, which has been revised from the previously Lookist policy. In the West, we have a Link West policy. In the northern side, we have a Connect Central Asia policy. In the southern side, we have a Sagar initiatives, security and growth for all in the regions, which is a pan concept for the Indo-Pacific formulations. So all of these initiatives are actually commercial and strategic in nature. And that has been quite seriously been noticed in Chinese among the Chinese policymakers to see India doing something and becoming more as an active power. Apart from all these things, I think there are two key events which has actually drastically changed the Chinese perception towards India. One is the Doklam incident. The way India actually responded to China in the Doklam incident, and I think that has got the Chinese in a quite surprising manner. In fact, if you see the Doklam incident, the whole attempt from the Chinese side with regard to the Doklam incident was to create division between India and Bhutan. And they succeeded to some extent doing that. But then again, the Chinese are doing this for many years. They have been successfully creating diffusion between India's partners and partners between other partnerships in Asia and outside Asia. So the Chinese have been partly been successfully in their approach in the Doklam incident. But again, the way India responded to the Doklam incident, the way Indian army crossing the international line of actual control and going there and standing for 73 days long to face the PLA, that was got the PLA in surprise and China's policymakers in surprise. I don't think, apart from the US Army, any other military in the world would dare currently to do that. And I think in that context, the Chinese have taken a note that it is not the traditional India, the 1962 India that they were facing. Today, they saw a new India under Modi, and that has actually changed the Chinese perception to some extent. Another factor, which is not really a factual factor in the sense that it's not entirely linked with the current thing, but it is actually a factor linked with China's rise, which we need to understand. One of the key features about China's rise has been the way China has actually looked at the regional powers and different regions of Asia. In that context, if you see, when I started traveling for the first time to China in 2002 or 3, when I started my PhD program, barely, I think Jeff will understand this point because he has written on the subject and we have discussed in length about this. 2002, 2003, you will find 5 to 7 mainstream institutes only covering India and South Asia. Today, hundreds of institutes, hundreds of think tanks are around China covering about India and South Asia. And primarily because they have seen India's developmental programs, even though they don't really buy India's infrastructural development and domestic development, but they have seen India's rise in a new context. That realization has been taken seriously by the Xi Jinping administration, and therefore we do see a subtle change in Chinese approach towards India. And therefore, I argued in my presentation that despite of all the tensions happening between US and China, India would not really go to the extent of messing up its relationship with China because we do realize that China is looking at India in a different way, and India would also like to see China in a new context. When Xi Jinping is coming, one would see that the Wuhan framework, which was decided, which was built after the Doklam incident, when Prime Minister Modi went to China, we had a Wuhan consensus to take it forward more in an engaging style. One would expect that the same momentum would be carried forward. So US-China rivalry has actually given a context for India and China to really look at each other. Despite of their traditional problems remaining intact, boundary to Tibet, to many other water, to maritime tensions, both will look at each other in a new context.
Okay, if it's okay with you gentlemen, I think what would be most efficient is to take a few questions together, and then we could answer them together, just so that we can get to as many questions as we can. So we'll start right here for the first one.
Hi, Akil Berry with the Eurasia Group. Prior to Doklam, it really seemed that India and China were poking each other in the eye a bit. So China blocking India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group, the refusal to list Masood Azhar as a global terrorist at the UN, and India refusing to sign on to the Belt and Road and becoming a vocal opponent of the Belt and Road Initiative. After Doklam, those tensions kind of simmered down and seemed to have reset the relationship. But now there are other potential stress points in the relationship. First, India's decision to bifurcate Jammu and Kashmir into Ladakh. Home Minister Amit Shah mentioning that India considers Aksai Chin as a complete part of India. And now recently, we've also had potentially the decision on Huawei and the cancellation of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to India and the cancellation of a Lieutenant General's visit to China. Going off of what Jeff said about the goodwill that India has accumulated over the years in trying not to provoke China too much, do you see these recent actions in India affecting the goodwill, or would you say it's kind of the relationship has strengthened to the point where it can survive these sorts of tensions? Thanks.
Thanks. Two hot button issues we've introduced right there: Huawei, Kashmir. Let's go over here, right in the end here.
Hi, my name is Saba Khan. I'm with the Voice of America. And my question is, despite the economic emergence of China and India, the human rights situation remains a concern in these two countries. How do you see the future unfold for the two countries with reference to human rights?
And then, yes, sir.
My question is dealing with now that China is beginning to recognize India as a regional power, what steps are they taking to keep India from growing that power in the district, like maybe making better relations with Pakistan or some of the other Southeast Asian powers? Thank you.
Why don't we keep things there for now? Which one of you would like to start? Either one of you.
Let me answer that last question first. We know for a fact, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that one of the key features of China's rise in Asia and beyond Asia has been how systematically China is replacing US in the region. And that obviously comes as an obstacle for India too. So if we take the example of South Asia, as I mentioned, Doklam was orchestrated in a way keeping in mind the objective of creating a division between India and Bhutan. Bhutan is the only country with whom China is not having a diplomatic ties. For long, they are trying to establish these diplomatic ties with Bhutan. So Doklam was created with an intent to create a much more suspectable way of perception between India and Bhutan, because India and Bhutan are close partners in the regions. Similarly, they have used Pakistan against India for many years. And this is what also we are seeing in Chinese approach when they built a port in Sri Lanka, in Hambantota, to their developmental projects in Bangladesh, to Nepal. So the whole attempt has been to restrict India's rise as much as possible, at the same time replace US from the region. Similarly, if you see in the grander context of Asia, and I think one of the key features of China has been that China has always looked the smaller countries in Asia much more seriously than any other power in the world. And if we see the Chinese foreign policy, today the Chinese presidents, prime minister, and their top leaders, almost every second year, one of them continuously visit to one of these small countries. And that's the approach we don't really see either in the US or in Indian approach. So we have left most of the smaller countries to be actually in good book of China. About the human rights issue, I think populist countries will always have these problems, managing rights, dealing with ethnic problems, socio-economic problems. So partly China and India are victim of that. They will be facing tastes from all of these issues. But I think there is a difference, and we can't really see China and India in the same prism when it comes to human rights. What is happening in Xinjiang, in Tibet, one could clearly call it a human rights violation. But that's not the case in Kashmir. I think the situation in Kashmir needs to be re-looked at it in the US prism. I was talking to some of the scholars and some of the officers in Congressional Research Service, is that the recent report also suggests a great deal that the way US look at the Kashmir problem and the human rights conditions there. I think every country would like to protect their national interest first. Every country would like to securitize their interest first, and that's what we are seeing on India's part with their recent approach in Kashmir. The revocation of Article 370 is not intended to affect human rights in the regions. Neither. No, no. I think one thing we are forgetting, that it's a multi-ethnic society, multi-religious society. Conflicts between societies, conflicts between religions and sects and ethnic groups, not necessarily means that the way the administration deals with, not necessarily means that it's an attempt to curb the human rights. I think there are different interpretations at us, the way we in the West look at human rights violation, and the way democratic societies, populist societies like India look at this issue. There are more Muslim populations are there in India than in Pakistan. We should not be forgetting that fact. So the way we handle the Muslim populations in Jammu and Kashmir is going to set an example for the rest of the India, and India would not really go to that extent. And I think the way the current government has managed the Kashmir problem is really tremendous and appreciated. And I think, therefore, we cannot really see China and India in the same prism when it comes to human rights violation. Populist society will always have a problem. But in the context of China, I think both Xinjiang and Tibet has been the national security problem for China, and the concern of the Uyghurs and Tibetan people in both the regions respectively has been overlooked by the Chinese government. That's not really the case in India. The Indian recent approach to Jammu and Kashmir is not linked with the human rights violation, because we need to see that the region has been a victim of terrorism. In fact, this region has been used against India as a to deploy different kind of terrorist activities within the country. So in order to strengthen the security there, in order to carry out developmental programs there, all of these recent initiatives has been taken up. So I don't think it is really making sense if we try to compare the human rights condition in China and India at all. With regard to other issues like Huawei to Article 370 to cancellation of visits, I think all of these issues are time and again going to haunt India-China relations. And these are day-to-day issues which are going to be the flashpoint in this relationship. In addition to that, we have classical problems like boundary, the other issues, water. And these issues are going to be there. And as immediate neighbors, both the countries has to deal with it. And given the fact that the way the Chinese are operating in India, their operations in India and rest of the world, the rest of the regions, there is an amount of concern attached to it. And India will be vigilant, be it Huawei, be it other initiatives. But I think one broader understanding that has emerged over the last few years, particularly after the Wuhan's consensus, Wuhan meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping, is that and we have been continuously, our leadership on both the sides has continuously been making this statement that differences should not be allowed to emerge as disputes. And that has been the defining line of India-China relations. You cannot change geography. So these differences and day-to-day differences we are having with China, from trade deficit to a Huawei problem to water problem, are going to be there. But the guiding principle that both the countries' leadership they want to frame the relationship is that let's look forward. And that's why during the Wuhan process, it was said that it is a relationship which should have an ambition and it should move forward. When we're saying officially a closer developmental relationship, we mean from both the sides, it should be a forwarding relationship. And therefore, I would link that point earlier by saying is that it has helped to some extent the Indian strategic communities that the perception in China about India has rapidly changed. Has rapidly changed. They are seeing in India in a new context. This is not to say that India does not see China as a concern, not to say that the threats from China has diminished. It's very much there. We will see incidents like Doklam, Chumar incident when Xi Jinping came to India in 2014. Incidents like Chumar will reappear, re-emerge again. Those incidents are going to haunt the relationship time to time. But saying that, I think there is a greater acceptance on both the sides that this relationship needs to be promoted further, both at the bilateral level and regional level. And therefore, U.S.-China rivalry has actually left a huge scope for India-China relations to relook at, and I think both the countries are looking at each other positively.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, actually, just a quick note to you first. I applaud you for giving this authentic Indian feel, because the last time I was this hot in a room, I was in Delhi. I think it's 85 degrees in here. But it works. It's facilitating discussion. It's great. Quick to Akhil. I didn't see either the Kashmir decision or Huawei, and frankly, there's been no decision on Huawei yet in India, as provocative toward China. I know Beijing tried to frame it that way, but the reality is the decision did not affect the external borders or India's claims in any way. Yes, the Indian government restated that it has not given up its claims over Aksai Chin or the Shaksgam Valley. I don't know why it would have, but it wasn't any change in its position. And on Huawei, you know, India's got a big decision to make coming up soon. But I wouldn't consider some kind of ban or setting of standards that keeps Huawei out as a sign of provocation toward China. Right? If I'm not going to let your rabid dog into my infant's room, that's not me provoking you. That's me taking sensible measures to protect my national security. Jagannath, maybe one place I would disagree with you is saying that China has replaced U.S. power in South Asia, that it has pushed out the U.S., that it is gaining ground. In fact, I would argue that it's been at India's expense, China's big push into South Asia and the Indian Ocean. It's not the U.S. that had a preponderance of influence or exclusive influence in many of these South Asian countries. It's India. And it's India that has seen that monopoly on influence eroded significantly over the past 10 years. And in fact, that has been the principal new point of contention in China-India relations, not the legacy disputes, not the border dispute, not the Dalai Lama, not Tibet, not even Pakistan. It's China's new presence, footprint, activities in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Pakistan, to a lesser degree in Bangladesh, in Bhutan. And that has come at India's expense. And in some ways, it may even be improving America's position in the Indian Ocean and South Asia, because you now have an India that was once desirous of expelling the U.S. from the Indian Ocean, now sees it as more of a stabilizing force. India and the U.S. are now cooperating on Sri Lanka, on the Maldives, in ways that we weren't before. And those countries want, just as they wanted China to help balance India's preponderance of influence, they now don't want to be a Chinese stooge either. So they want options. They want the more the better. So the new government in Sri Lanka and the Maldives have been very encouraging of the U.S. to come in. So that's maybe one place I would diverge slightly. I think Southeast Asia, there are other parts of the world where the growth of Chinese influence has come at America's expense, but maybe not South Asia so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before I respond to Jeff, let me address that point again about Article 370. You see, we accept it or not, if we look at the India-China boundary dispute and also the way China has been involved in the Kashmir problem and in the India-Pakistan-China triangular formulation in the region, China is a de facto third-party actor in the Kashmir problem. And I think in order not to give any further strategic mileage to China, the recent decision of India has a great deal linked with that particular formulation, in the sense that we have always seen that whenever there is anything to do with the India-China boundary dispute or Kashmir, China has preferred to comment. Even though one could argue that from 1990 onwards, China has maintained some kind of neutrality on the Kashmir issue, but still, they have gradually emerged as a de facto third country to influence the Kashmir problem to some extent. And I think the recent decision of India to revoke the Article 370 and remove that autonomy status from Jammu and Kashmir regions has actually helped India to maintain that edge to some extent on China. The edge is that it's an internal affair of India now. Jammu and Kashmir is not treated anything in special terms anymore. It's just a normal state of India. And that's the message we have passed to the China, that China should stop commenting. If China has to comment on things, then China has to revisit the Aksai Chin area that we lost in the 62 war. And I think with regard to Jeff's comment about China not replacing US in South Asia and replacing India, I think this point needs to be seen that US presence in South Asia was never a security-oriented presence. It was more of a commercial-oriented presence. And if we try to see US presence in the regions, particularly in South Asia, the US involvement in South Asia is relatively different from the US involvement in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. So the kind of replacement China has done to US is mostly on economic terms. And that kind of replacement, and India was never a competitor to China in that context. So I was referring to that China replacing US mostly as a economic power in the region, in the South Asian. And therefore, I did mention in my presentation that if you see each and every country, be it in South Asia, but in other parts of the Asia also, Southeast Asia to Central Asia, each of the smaller countries are taken much more seriously in Chinese foreign policy today than before. And therefore, the Chinese have made an a presence in South Asia. They have replaced not only US, but also other competing actors of Asia, including Japan and South Korea in the regions, to replace from the market base as an economic actor.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. I should say, Jeff, that I think that the temperature went up in the room literally and figuratively only when the word Kashmir came up. I don't want us to get distracted by that, as important an issue as it is. Another round of questions. There's a hand. Okay, we'll take a question here, and then if there are any others, we'll take them. Please, right over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Arifa Khalid. You said that China is meeting more of the smaller countries. Can you elaborate it a little bit more? Do you mean the smaller countries in South Asia or all over in the world? What does that really mean? India is not meeting the smaller countries, or what did you really mean by it? I didn't understand.
Okay, why don't you go ahead? I don't think we...
I think it has to be seen in terms of building capacities, in terms of engaging with the smaller countries, having good economic investment, trade and economic ties, partly because in comparison to the Chinese economy, Indian economy is really not competent. And that has not really been the case in last 10 years. China's comprehensive economic power base has been almost double and triple times than India. There, the Chinese have operated and succeeded in taking the smaller countries, the smaller economies, giving them aid, donations to financial assistance to investment packages attractive, which India has unable to do that. So in that context, I think the Chinese have succeeded. And that has been one of the principal aspect of its Belt and Road initiatives. We accept it, we do not accept it, we might raise questions, we might create controversies that is quite imminently visible in the Belt and Road initiatives. It looks non-transparent. It looks that the Chinese are giving money to impress them. But the reality of the fact that these are the societies which are looking for developments and economic benefits, and China is really providing that. Yes, India as a rising economy has started doing that. In fact, if you see, to some of the smaller economies, India have started giving the credit lines of agreements, credit line of financial assistance. But we are not yet really that kind of a scale of economy and competent economy in comparison to China, where we could give a free hand investment packages in terms of investing in a big way and giving a grant donations, which smaller economies, smaller countries would like to see India in as an alternative power in the regions. So yeah, that has to be seen in the growing economic cloud that China is leaving towards the smaller countries in the region.
All right. Yeah. Yes, sir. We'll come to you.
Hi, my name is Greg Moore. I'm from the University of Nottingham's China campus, but I have a wonderful sabbatical at SAIS this fall. So I have a question that I'd like to hear both of your responses. Is there any chance that with the U.S. pressure on China over Huawei and sort of the U.S. emphasis on the Quad and the U.S. pressure on India to make a choice between China and India, between China and the U.S., is there any potential, do you think, that actually this could lead India and China to have a kind of entente, that they might both get tired of the U.S. and decide to work closer together in a way that the U.S. will be sort of at a disadvantage in that triangle?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't you take that? Maybe that could be the last question.
I think it's a
Start.
really good question. And I think that the set of challenges confronting India-U.S. relations right now are actually more formidable than they have been in some time, maybe even in the past decade. And that's contributing to this dynamic that I think you're referring to. Most of it stems from the Trump administration's focus on economic issues, which have traditionally been a point of contention between India and the U.S., but have traditionally been subservient to strategic convergence. Under the Trump administration, those grievances that American companies have had with Indian trade and investment practices have gotten a hearing in the White House, and the USTR has been empowered and is going is promoting and pushing these issues hard, not just with India, with a lot of countries. But that led to the steel and aluminum tariffs, the revocation of GSP benefits. I think you also have CAATSA sanctions on Russian importers of Russian defense equipment. You have sanctions on those who are purchasing Iranian oil, which have caused some friction in the bilateral relationship. And so I do see there's a very formidable coalition in both countries that are committed to this partnership in a very unusual manner, spanning both political parties. There's very little disagreement between Republicans and Democrats, between Congress and the BJP. Everybody was on board with this relationship. So a very formidable coalition in both countries, but one that I think is showing some signs of vulnerability now, particularly with the actions of the Trump administration and how it's approached the U.S.-India relationship. And so I think it is more vulnerable now to the type of backsliding or the type of pressure that I think you referred to. However, I think in large part, backsliding would look more like a slowing of positive momentum than actual retraction. Because I think the institutional groundwork has already been laid in both countries, and those coalitions do remain formidable enough that the greater risk comes from the U.S. and India the pace of cooperation slowing further rather than reversing. But it's a very important and relevant dynamic right now.
I would agree with that point of view that Jeff actually offered. I think one of the defining element of India-US relationship in the 21st century has been that it was growing comprehensively, not only on the trade and economic front, but also on the defense and security. In fact, if we take into account the last 3-4 years security and defense partnership, it had offered a amount of enormous confidence to this bilateral relationship. Suddenly, there is an amount of uncertainties and doubts, clouds about the relationship. Maybe because of the way Trump has approached to the Asian allies, and also partly, I think, India has started looking, as I mentioned, one of the key features of India's foreign policy has been to look at the immediate neighbors and extended neighbors. That has helped India to mature up as a power, to have more independent way of thinking. So even on the one hand, majority of the constituent in Indian foreign policy, they would still like to factor US as the most important and the top partners. Still, there is also a amount of thinking that we need to move beyond US to position ourselves as a greater regional power, if not a global power. And I think within that framework, China fits there as a partner, despite of all our problems. And that framework has partly also arisen because India smartly has dealt with its own problems over the last 2 to 3 decades quite smartly and diligently, be it the problems in managing with China, not really succumbing to US pressure on multiple issues, and also trying to configure its own interest with other countries in the regions. It has given enormous confidence to Indian policymakers to position that kind of framework. So I would really see that if there is not a course correction is being made in India-US relation quickly, then probably the momentum will be lost. And particularly at a time when this relationship was really moving ahead. And also at a factual ground, we could see that, even this is a relationship to reckon with. President Trump has not really visited India yet. He has been invited twice, but he has not really accepted the invitation. So it creates a context when the top leadership meet. Of course, they are met in third country platform. They are met in other multilateral forums. But when they meet on their home grounds, it actually helps to give the relationship a different note and tone.
And just the flip side of your question, though, is what are the prospects for an India-China strategic engagement? And there, I think the prospects are less likely, because I think the structural differences in the bilateral relationship from the border to Pakistan to Tibet have these legacy disputes have not diminished. They've been shadowing the relationship now since the 1962 war, and they're almost no closer to resolution, and in some ways have become more contentious, including the relationship with Pakistan. Not only have they not diminished or been resolved, but they've been joined by new friction points, like China's, the expansion of Chinese activities and influence in the Indian Ocean, like India's growing proximity to the US and Japan. It is natural that these two countries would have a growing conflict of interests as their spheres of influence and activity expand and overlap. So I think there are structural issues creating tension in the relationship that will be difficult to overcome.
I would just add a small point by saying that all of these problems are bound to be there in India-China, and they are, as I mentioned, it's going to haunt from time to time India-China relation. But despite of all of these things, I think both the countries have reached to a virtual consensus, which is emerging from the Wuhan consensus primarily, that they want a economic oriented relationship, and that is going to see some momentum, some positive momentum, and we'll see that both India and China cooperating with each other, not only at the bilateral level but also at a regional level in a lot of economic configuration, be it multilateral mechanisms to trade dealings to have some kind of cooperation. Those kind of cooperation will continue to happen. But yes, I agree with Jeff that the problem in India-China relationship is the classical structural problem. The classical problems are going to haunt them from time to time.
Well, we should move to wrap up now. This has been a really engaging conversation, and I think, don't remember which one of you said it, but I agree that this U.S.-China-India triangle is really one of the most consequential in the world. You're looking at the world's only superpower, what may be the next superpower, and then another country that wants to be in that conversation as well and could be getting there. So if you could thank me, or give a round of applause to thank, yeah. Well, yeah, you're welcome to thank me too, but thank our panel, Jagannath and Jeff. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.